Listener discretion is advised. Hello and welcome to Scary Time, the podcast that helps you find new, emerging, and undiscovered scary and paranormal podcasts. I'm Greg, the host and curator of Scary Time. Today's episode is from Octoberpod AM. Octoberpod After Midnight is the retro horror show for bold individualists, telling true, true-ish, and classic tales of horror and paranormal with cozy retro vintage aesthetic. If you like today's episode, make sure to check out the episode description for links to subscribe. All right, let's get this show started.
Begin.
The sound you hear is a wood-burning stove. This is the start of Octoberpod on the Darkcast Network.
Granddad was a coal miner, West Virginia, but he immigrated from Ireland when he was a young man. But before coming here, he lived in a small village, I suppose you'd call it, in County Clare, Ireland.
Our Daily Bread, a true story submitted by Doug AM 460, narrated by Edward October.
And me and the other grandkids would love listening to him tell stories from the old country. He spoke with an accent that had 1 foot in Ireland and 1 foot in the holler. I can't imitate it, but just imagine it coming out of a leathery old dude sitting by a wood-burning stove, holding court with all the young'uns in the family while Mamaw cleans away the supper dishes. Yeah, I can still smell the smoke coming off of that stove and hear the clattering of Mamaw's dishes, and can just about taste her gravy and the mashed potatoes that she'd whip up with a hand mixer. But that's not the story I'm here to tell. I guess I got kind of carried away with my remembering for a minute. So we're at Mamaw and Granddad's house listening to him tell stories. He'd usually have to smoke him a Camel cigarette down to the nub before we'd get him in a talkative mood. He told this on a windy night in the dead of winter. Hell, it might have been Christmas night, the night of the 25th. Whenever it was, he picked the right night to tell it. Because me and my brothers, we still remember it like it just happened. So, according to Granddad, there's this mom and pop bakery, a bake shop he called it, down in his village. I guess everything would have been pretty mom and pop at the time. He said you could go in there and they'd have all kinds of stuff us kids had never heard of before. Soda bread, hot cross buns, raisin and walnut scones, griddle bread, I forget what all else. Mince pies, steak and kidney pie, stuff like that. He said they were much too poor to get anything sweet like a fruit pie or scone or anything. But for whatever reason, they'd get him a loaf of bread from there every week or every other week. After hearing stories of how poor his family was, that sounded like an awful big expenditure to me. Maybe they just had some other arrangement with the baker or something. Anyways, Granddad said that his ma, he called her, would send him down to the bakery ever so often and get him a loaf of bread. Said she'd send him down with one coin and that sometimes he'd even get change back. It was run by a man named Michael and his wife Geraldine. Geraldine would do all the baking and Michael would mind the shop and take your money. Now, one thing I forgot to mention was that this village was in an out-of-the-way part of the county, and this bakery wasn't really in town. It was run out of the lady's house on the edge of town, and from the sound of it, the edge of town wasn't a whole lot different from the middle of nowhere. Granddad made out like it was quite a hike just to get there from where he lived. So this one day, he walked down real early in the morning. It had been raining, and there's a thick mist or fog that had settled down over everything. In Ireland, he said it was always raining, or fixing to rain, or had just quit raining. So Granddad, he was about 9 or 10 at the time, made his way through the swirling mists to the bakery. He popped inside the shop, and he said you just go to the shelf and pick what you want, stick it in a poke, and go pay. He remembered that the bread wasn't as fresh as he's used to. He didn't smell anything baking in the oven, and none of the loaves were hot. Granddad had been looking forward to carrying warm bread in his arms, for the walk home. on account of the weather was so rotten. When he went to the counter to pay, there wasn't anybody to take his money. Was the bake shop closed? No. The sign said open and the lights were on. Doors unlocked. Must have been busy somewhere else in the house. There was a bell that he could have rung, but he said he would have felt rude and pushy, especially as a little kid. So he leaned on that counter and waited. Started flipping a coin, spinning it, playing heads or tails games with it. Still, there wasn't nobody come to the counter. Said he'd been waiting, maybe 5 or 10 minutes. Finally, he leaned over to the counter and hollered for somebody to come and take his money. No answer. He leaned over the counter another time and noticed a dark lump on the floor. It was Michael, the bake shop owner, and he wasn't breathing. Granddad went behind the counter to walk into the house. You know, the living space is just beyond the bake shop part. And he crept around looking for Geraldine and hollered out that her husband was sick and needed help, even though he knew that the man was dead. He said it was deathly quiet in that house. All he could hear was the creaking of the floorboards as he stepped. But he thought he heard Geraldine walking around, slowly, upstairs. He got to the steps leading to the second floor and saw Geraldine's hand hanging over the top step, as if she has collapsed on the top landing, with her arm splayed out, the only part of her visible from the bottom of the steps. He said her skin was ghostly pale and her wrist looked pretty badly bruised, but her fingers weren't moving. And then all of a sudden there came the squeaking and crackling of footsteps on the floorboards overhead. Now, by this point in the story, all of us kids realized that Granddad had walked in on the scene of a murder, and with the killer still upstairs creeping around. God, you can't imagine the thrill and the icy dread that come over us when he told it. You know, with the fire popping in that wood stove and with the wind whistling outside and everything. I remember my brother piped up and asked, "What'd you do then?" Granddad just leaned back in his chair and said, "I laid my money down on the counter and walked home with my bread."
Roadkill Roulette, written by MJ McAddams, from a true story submitted by Trey D., narrated by Edward October, with ghost vocalizations performed by Paige Elmore. We played this game on one occasion. At the time, we were calling it Roadkill Roulette because we figured roadkill is about the only thing we'd find playing it. By God, I wish that was true. If somebody's telling me this story for the first time, I don't think I'd believe it myself. But if you doubt what I'm about to tell you, I will send you a signed affidavit from my buddy Campbell Bogus, who was there with me at the time. The other day, a couple weeks ago, I guess it's about 2 or 3 weeks ago, I was binging some YouTube videos, kind of dozing off, watching YouTube videos about people using this Randonautica app and finding all kind of weird stuff. It got me thinking about how when I was a lot younger, back before smartphones and all that, we had our own low-tech ways of getting into weird adventures. I think I can safely say that me and my buddy Campbell were like early randonauts. Maybe retro randonauts? Paleo randonauts? We grew up in the holler. I suspect you did too, Ed. And we didn't have a whole lot to keep us entertained. We didn't even have cable. We only got 3 channels on the TV. So we had to be a whole lot more, I guess you'd say, imaginative to entertain ourselves. Wild turkey and blackberry shine was often the answer, but we weren't into all that. We were usually too broke for a case of Natty Light and underage to boot. Campbell and I would drive around town in his dad's old Chevy and just talk mostly. Talking about cars and dreaming about women, like that old song says. Sometimes on the weekends, we'd head over to the main branch of the public library and go through the discard box looking to find some Stephen King's or Tom Clancy's, maybe some comics. One day I scored it was like a book of magic. spells and potions and stuff. Now, we're a deeply religious community, and this wasn't long after the days when churches were burning scary stories to tell in the dark, along with white zombie CDs for being too satanic. So a book like this would be extremely hard for us to come by. Honestly, I can't imagine why the library would have a book like that on their shelves anyway. It was marked up with handwritten notes and scribbles, like one of my Nana's recipe books. On the last page, I found some faded handwritten instructions. The spell of finding, and it started with a silly poem. Ye shall find what ye seek, be it angel, demon, or foe, if ye follow these words I have written below. Write your intentions on the dried hide of a deer and burn it immediately. Gather the ashes in your hands and rub them on a bird of prey's bones. Toss the bones and read the signs. They'll take you to what you seek. Note, advanced spell. Do not attempt without a knowledge of the mystic arts and sorcery. Me and Campbell got awful tickled reading what must have been the ramblings of some crackpot. But we were bored and curious. We didn't have deer hide or bird bones, but we did have a pen, an old notebook, and a quarter. What we didn't have was a clear idea of what we were seeking. We thought for a minute, and Campbell started grinning. He tore out a sheet of notebook paper and wrote down, I seek a gorgeous redhead. We giggled for a minute. Campbell had a thing for Angie Everhart ever since he saw her in Bordello of Blood. Must have rented that tape once a month. Then I flicked the lighter and burnt the page. Watched it burn, and then we rubbed the ashes all over my lucky quarter. We made a set of rules. The original spell wanted us to throw bones and listen to them, whatever that meant. What we came up with was we'd start driving and flip the coin whenever we hit a four-way intersection. Heads would go left, tails would go right. If we dropped the coin or anything like that, we'd just keep going straight. So we hopped back in the Chevy and took off up a road with Campbell driving and me flipping. We're going along for a while and ended up way outside of town pretty quick. We got so damn lost, couldn't believe it. Driving through country we'd never seen before. Ended up on some dirt road way down in Unicoi County. Cousin, that road got narrower and narrower until it stopped at a cattle guard in front of a green metal fence and a bunch of posted property signs. The coin flips were telling us to go on through the metal fence. So, young and stupid as we were, we parked that Chevy truck and continued on foot. It was in the fall of the year, and we left town about 3 in the afternoon. So by the time we made it this far, it was getting on about supper time. The sky was overcast, so we couldn't hardly tell how low the sun was in the sky. Campbell liked to night hunt, so he always had a couple of wheat lights in the truck with him. A wheat light is a type of light you'd use for mining. There's a heavy battery pack that you strap to a belt with a corded headlamp attached. So we strapped on our wheat lights, hopped that fence, headed up through the grassy field. There's a clear trail to follow, and if it ever seemed to fork off in any way, we'd flip a coin. Now, this grassy field butted up against a patch of thick brush and a tree line, and the trail cut right up into the woods. We got a few paces inside the tree line, and then we both stopped at about the same time, noticing how unnaturally quiet it was. And just at the top of the next rise, we saw her. We couldn't make out her face or nothing, but she had long red hair that was tangled and matted with leaves. She's wearing a white sundress on an evening that was way too chilly for sundresses. The hem of her skirt looked torn at the bottom, and one of the straps just kind of hung off the right shoulder. One of us, I believe it must have been Campbell, hollered at her and she ran. We took off after her and followed her up the hill until she, and I swear on a stack of Bibles it's true, she vanished. Just poof, gone. By now it's full dark. If she hadn't been wearing white, there'd have been no way we could have followed her, even with our lights on. We went digging around to the last spot where we saw her standing, and I caught sight of something kind of shiny buried beneath some leaves. It was an old handsaw. The handle was rotten, and the blade was rusty and smeared with something that looked like blood. Not bright red, but kind of dark brown, like the color of blood when it dries. Was it blood? I don't know. I didn't want to find out, though. We decided it's time to go, and we lit out of there quick. I can't tell you how we found our way back to the truck. We drove the backwoods, finding road signs. People weren't carrying smartphones with GPS back in those days, until we found State of Franklin and drove straight back into town. We didn't speak of it for about a week, and we didn't run and tell anybody else about it either. Who'd have believed us? The next Saturday, I brought it up to Campbell. I'm pretty sure that we both thought we'd seen a ghost or our eyes had played tricks on us, but the longer I thought about it and prayed on it, the more I realized that girl must have been real. And if she was, didn't we have an obligation and a civil duty to help her? I suggested that we talk to Campbell's aunt, who worked as a secretary down at the sheriff's office, but Campbell said they'd just as likely say we dreamed it up. Hell, we might have gotten in trouble for trespassing, but I eventually wore him down and convinced him to go looking for her. What can I say? When you're young, you just don't think right. We brought some supplies this time, a backpack with some food and water, 2 wheat lights, a compass, 2 knives, and Campbell's rifle with plenty of ammunition. We had a notion that if somebody called the law on us for trespassing, we'd be able to say we were just out squirrel hunting or something. That would at least sound a lot less crazy than saying we were out ghost hunting. This time, we were able to drive back by memory. We had a vague notion of how to get there from a highway, and a few wrong turns notwithstanding, we ended up at that old metal fence well before sundown. Once we started walking through the woods, we relied on the quarter again to guide us to the redhead. That led us straight to the same rusty old handsaw on the hill. And then right on cue, she appeared. I don't know if she was standing closer or if we could see better in the daylight, but either way, we could see just how messed up she was. Her arm, where the dress was torn, was twisted at a sick angle. Her feet were bare and bloody. Her bangs covered her eyes, but her lips were cut and swollen. We couldn't see her eyes, but we knew she was watching us. Then we heard this weak voice, sounding like a dead cat being dragged through the gravel.
Why aren't you helping me?
Then she took off running. She had us weaving between trees even as we ran after her, shouting for her to stop. She just kept running. At one point, I was close enough to reach out a hand to stop her, but my ankle caught on something and I went flying forwards. Hit the ground so hard I was spitting up leaves. And of course, she was gone again. I looked down at what I had tripped on. It was a purse. It had been unzipped and emptied, and the strap had snapped. I'm not sure if I broke the strap when I tripped or if it had always been like that. Campbell come over and sat next to me long enough for us to drink some water and decide whether or not I'd sprained my ankle. I hadn't. Long enough for the sun to sink down behind the tree line. I'd say we had about 5 or 10 minutes of twilight before it got completely dark. When we stood back up, we took one glance back into the woods, and there she was again. She was standing closer to us than ever before. She was just about on top of us, in fact. Close enough to make out her face, if it weren't hidden behind a hank of red hair. Soon as we saw her, she turned away and began walking into the brush. We didn't follow her, because I suppose we'd figured out there's no catching her. She looked over her shoulder at us and spoke in a small, gravelly voice.
I'm right here. Why aren't you helping me?
Now we started following close behind her. She didn't run this time, she just kind of limped at a steady pace. The girl stopped with her back against the trunk of a rotted out old hickory tree. Then without a sound, she threw her head back with her mouth gaped open wide, like in a silent scream. And then poof, gone. Just gone. When me and Campbell went home that night, I think we'd made sort of an unspoken agreement not to speak of this ever again. Not to each other, and not to anybody else. And that's what we did until maybe about a week or two after Thanksgiving that year. Campbell come over to my house and took me to my bedroom and shut the door. He had a copy of the Johnson City Press under his arm. He opened it up to a page with a story about a body being found in a shallow grave on a trail in Unicoi County. There's a picture of state troopers digging around the base of an old hickory tree, and paper said that the remains were believed to be those of Jeannie Kirkland, age 17, of Elizabethton, who'd gone missing after a high school football game. The body had been dismembered, and medical examiners estimated she'd been dead since late September, not long after she went missing. There was another picture. It was a senior class photo. The photo was black and white, but anybody could tell, maybe because of the freckles, that this girl had gorgeous red hair. She was wearing her varsity cheerleading uniform. I felt something like a lead weight pressing down on my chest. Campbell looked at me in the eye and thumped the picture. And then he said, "This is her, isn't it?" Come Hither, Come Yon, a true story narrated by Edward October. I never liked to talk about the weeks Daddy had nothing to say. That was the beginning of what the doctors at the time diagnosed as some sort of psychotic break. I was 12 years old at the time, and I remember Daddy coming home off a swing shift. When he worked the third, he'd just shuffle off to bed just as Mama was getting me off to school. Then, whenever we saw him, he wouldn't speak to a soul, and this would go on for a stretch of days and days. One night, Mama went to bed early, and me and Daddy stayed up watching TV. Now, I loved sitting up late with Daddy watching TV during one of his quiet spells. That meant I could turn the TV to whatever program I wanted. We were watching something, and he turned and looked at me. He had this awful look on his face, and the flicker of the TV made him look almost ghostly-like. And he said, "I've been here too long. The longer I stay, the longer I will stay," he said. I told him I didn't understand what he was talking about. And then he proceeded to tell me this long, convoluted story about how he was a member of a sort of tribe of what he called travelers. Now, these travelers were capable of identifying doorways that only they could traverse. Doorways that would take them to another time and place, from the times within a 40-year window of the traveler's birth years. 40 years before or 40 years after. Daddy said that he's never traveled farther back than 1942, and he never traveled further into the future than today. We had this talk around Thanksgiving of 1999. Well, I said, "Daddy, you're joking, right? This is scary." At first, I played along like it was a joke, but this seemed to make him angry. He kept on giving me details. Daddy told me that when you exit a doorway, you're a different person. New body, different age. You could be a man or a woman or a child. It was a roll of the dice. But he said if you keep traveling, you can just about live forever. He said that he usually traveled with the rest of his tribe, going through doorways together, setting up new lives together, and then leaving together. He said the last time he traveled, he exited the door as a 7-year-old boy. Members of his tribe placed him with an adoption agency. That's where he claimed my Nana and Pawpaw adopted him. I already knew he was an adoptee. And from there he just grew up like a normal kid, got married, became a father. Daddy said that the rest of his tribe moved on years ago, and he slowly began to forget who he really was, all the past lives he'd lived. "I just wanted to prepare you," he kept telling me. "I've been here too long, and I'll have to travel again soon, but probably not until after Christmas." Now, I still thought he was kind of joking, but I played along, and I asked him why he had to travel. Why not stay with me and Mama? He told me never to tell Mama anything he just said. Then he said, "I'm all through talking," and started watching TV again. We both dozed off halfway through some western that came on. I believe it was Adios Sabata with Yul Brynner. His quiet spell ended the next day. Everything returned to normal for a while, and honestly, I didn't think anything of our conversation. Maybe he'd been joking like I thought. Maybe I'd fallen asleep in front of the TV and just dreamed that we'd had that conversation. Or maybe I was awake and Daddy was halfway in a dream when he talked to me. Well, that didn't last long. whenever we were out, Daddy started looking off in the distance at things that weren't really there. We were with my uncle on his farm. He'd bought a new hunting dog that he wanted to show off to Daddy. The dog lot was a bit of a walk from the house. And as we walked, Daddy kept looking way off in the distance at something on the hill behind the dog lot. He asked my uncle, "Who is that guy?" "What guy?" "Feller in the black hoodie." When my uncle and I assured him there was nobody there, he just stopped in his tracks, grabbed me by the wrist, and we ran back to the truck. He didn't talk again for a whole week. Another time, me and Mama had been out shopping with my cousin on Black Friday. Daddy met us for supper at the Olive Garden. He was laughing and joking, telling funny stories about guys he worked with at the tire company. And then he stopped mid-sentence. He got up from his seat and headed straight out of the restaurant. Mama told me to go with him and that she'd ride back with my cousin. He almost ran off and left me before I could get in the truck. Well, I begged him to tell me what was going on as he peeled out of that Olive Garden and off into the highway. And he said, "Remember that conversation we had several weeks ago?" He goes, "I didn't tell you about the others. We call them the fleet ones, for whatever reason. They're kind of like the traffic cops. They don't want nobody to find out about the doorways, you see. Traveling. Only travelers can see them. If they find you, they drag you off to somewheres. Maybe hell. Nobody knows. Nobody that's ever been dragged off by them will ever come back to tell about it. I've seen other travelers dragged off, and it ain't pretty. It's like they drag them off by the soul." I asked Daddy if that was what he'd seen at the farm and at the Olive Garden. He nodded and told me he sees them all the time now. He said he'd been here too long and they'd get him if he didn't travel again soon. This is what finally frightened me enough to tell my mother. She didn't seem as surprised by this news as I figured she'd be. Maybe she already knew. Maybe he'd been taken by one of these crazy spells before. So we hauled Daddy off to the doctor's appointments and CAT scans and MRIs and blood work and therapists. They weren't able to diagnose him with anything specific, but they gave him a cocktail of meds, antidepressants mostly. They figured that would help, and they did for a while. He took his pills and went to his follow-up appointments like a good boy, and everything seemed even keel for the most part. Except sometimes I'd catch him doodling in an old notebook we kept next to the phone. Pictures of men or old hags all in black with no faces. Sometimes he'd scribbled over the blackness where a face ought to be so hard that the pen tore a hole in the paper. The type of thing you see in all kinds of scary movies. And except every now and then he'd flip past an old episode of Quantum Leap or Doctor Who on our PBS affiliate, and he'd say that those shows must have been written by travelers, because in both shows there's a time traveler that changes his identity in some way. He'd also read a lot of old sci-fi novels, especially Brian Aldiss. I remember he had a battered, dog-eared copy of Dracula Unbound, and he came up to me one evening and he showed me all these references to fleet ones that he underlined. He just looked at me and arched his eyebrow up as if to say, "Found me another traveler." Then one evening he was doing dishes. Mom was off at Bible study. He started singing to himself. The tune was kind of like Ramblin' Man by Hank Williams, except he sang it with different lyrics. There's an open door in front of me. There's faces in the mirror I've got to see. but then they'll claim my soul before the dawn, and lovers will meet, come hither, come yon. I never knew him to ever listen to Hank. I'd never heard him sing before in my whole life. Well, Christmas came and went that year, but Daddy didn't go nowhere, and I sort of figured that Daddy was cured of his compulsion, or whatever it was, and I sort of forgot about all of it. I wish I hadn't. That way I would have paid more attention to all the times he'd wander off to inspect sinkholes and animal burrows, or check out the rear exits and sub-basements of department stores. In hindsight, it's easy to see that he was looking for doorways. I guess anyone else would have found his behavior odd and suspicious right off the bat, but to us, with Daddy, it didn't seem odd at all, especially after a lifetime of suspicious behavior. Then, one weekend around Groundhog's Day, he's driving me out to look for this comic book store way down in Unicoi County. It was gray and cold that day with just enough rain to make everything look wet and greasy. Daddy turned to me and he said, "You know, Dennis, if I ever did travel again, chances are good I'd end up somewhere in your lifetime. I'd be sure to look you up." I started crying. It was a real ugly cry. I yelled at him. I told him that may be true, but if it wasn't a bunch of bullshit, and it probably was, I said you'd come back, but you wouldn't be you. I kept repeating that. You wouldn't be you, Daddy. You wouldn't be you. We drove all the way out to this comic book store without saying another word. We got there, and he bought me just about everything I wanted. I still have those books. And then we drove back home, but we took a detour through Johnson City, and he bought me this big lunch at the Red Lobster. Just me and my dad. Turned out to be a great day. The best day. A week later, he went missing. When Daddy didn't come home from work one night, we chalked it up to one of his strange spells. But by supper time the next day, we called the police. It didn't take long for his truck to turn up. It was parked on a gravel road up in the mountains, right up against a barbed wire fence that marked off a few acres of posted property. Police said there were no signs of foul play. Daddy had even left his keys in the ignition as if he'd be right back. But maybe he's leaving the truck behind for us to pick up later. And Mama still has that truck. I think it still runs. Me and Mama kept the lights on for him and stayed involved with groups of volunteers who kept searching for Daddy long after the police had moved on to other priorities. But in our hearts, we knew Daddy was gone for good. We were right. Daddy's never seen again. When I got my driver's license, I used to go on long drives in the mountains. More often than not, I'd end up along that fence row where Daddy abandoned his truck. I never did it to look for Daddy. I guess I wanted to poke around and see if I could find the doorway. I know it sounds stupid. There was a rotted out log that might have done the trick, but who knows? Daddy could have walked a mile or more into the woods looking for it. Yeah, that's crazy. That sounds crazy, I know it. Still, whenever I'm back in town, to this day, I'll look twice when I see someone dressed all in black, especially someone that doesn't seem to belong, and I start thinking about Daddy's fleet ones. Sometimes I have dreams about the fleet ones come swarming towards me across stormy seas, swarming like these great big flocks of migrating birds, blacker than that. Still, there are other times when I catch a stranger staring at me from across the street, or over from a far corner of the Walmart or something. I've convinced myself that they're staring at me as if they know me, even though I've never met them before. Then I wonder if it's Daddy wearing somebody else's body and living somebody else's life. I wonder if Daddy walked through a doorway to find me. But it isn't really him. Not really. The tape advances for a few moments until, finally, a woman fills the frame. Mid-30s, unkempt hair, but still pretty. She's been crying. When she speaks into the camera, her voice is something very close to a croak.
My name is Jane Woods, and I'm a very ordinary person. I wish that I had never watched that video cassette, or that having done so, I had died. I found it in 1996 on the day they buried my mamaw. It was a Saturday before Christmas.
The light from a window outside the frame brightens, and its glare activates the autofocus. Her face blurs, then comes into focus for a moment, and blurs again.
In those days back home, I had an unsavory reputation. That's a nice way to put it, right? I suppose I'd even made some poor decisions in high school, and maybe even up through my 20s. If you'd ever known my mother, you'd understand why. I'm not making excuses, I'm just explaining. Mama Ellen raised me because my mom couldn't raise her daughter from the Marshall County Jail, or while she was blowing truckers for pills at the Texaco in Wytheville. Everyone in town thought I was a slut, so I didn't want the preacher to drive me to Jackson's apartment after the funeral. Jackson Trent, he was my boyfriend at the time. That's where I found it, the videocassette, at Jackson's apartment, in a shoebox up on a beam.
She clears her throat and pushes a strand of hair, flecked with new grays, behind her ears. It's a nervous gesture. She feels stripped naked by the camera, whose gaze seems to obsess over the shape of her lips, their fullness and lack of color.
At first I thought Jackson might have put it there for me to find, some kind of weird joke. But when I watched the stuff recorded there, I knew it was impossible.
Her head dips slightly out of frame as she picks up a videocassette. She holds it up so that the camera can get a good close look. VHS format, in a battered slipcase. The slipcase bears a logo, as well as stray marks that might have been made by a child playing with a marker. Some of these resemble rudimentary letters or simple faces, but are too crude to really make out.
I don't even like to keep it near me. I can't sleep nights if I do. There's a bank in another town where I hide it in a little safe deposit box. I'll lock it up again when we're done.
What no one knows or cares to remember is that there were 3 Gorgons. Each one possessed a visage hideous enough to turn a man to stone with her gaze. Their names, depending on whom one asks, were Medusa, Megara, and Stheno. But their true names, for they live within the human soul, are despair, longing, and heartache.
It was wet and cold that day, and I'd never felt so numb. I wondered if Mamaw felt that way just before the end, and then I realized that it'd have to have been worse. Those waves of tears and shuddering just washed over me again.
It had, in fact, been so much worse that the doctors euthanized Jane's Mamaw by inserting a needle into her eye tissue. and that was just to ensure they wouldn't bury her alive. But even then, they couldn't be sure. They used special equipment to verify that her heart and brain activity had stopped before declaring her dead.
But how could anyone really tell under all that stone? And anyway, we knew that she stayed awake long enough after the stone made it impossible for her to breathe.
The 11 o'clock news, WCYB was the only news anyone in town ever watched, appeared that night with its bluster of upbeat, yet urgent intro music. A news anchor teased a story about a Marshall County woman's death being linked to a local legend. For such a rural area, where a bedbug infestation at a public library passed for hard news, this had to be the story of a lifetime, if not a dozen lifetimes. Footage shot at Mamaw Ellen's home played throughout the news segment. Camera pans across a daybed in the home of Ellen B. Woods. 7 handmade sock monkeys line the bed in 2 neat rows. They stare at the lens with unseeing button eyes. One of them is called Mojo. Jane had clutched Mojo throughout her pitiable childhood. Here he sits, still beloved but now forgotten, replaced long ago by a succession of Jane's self-absorbed lovers. Mojo would never again comfort a sad or frightened child in the small hours of the night. He now exists only as a small length of analog magnetic videotape. A freak electrical fire will destroy the WCYB video archives in 11 years. When this videotape burns, it will be as though Mojo never existed. WCYB reported about as many details of the incident as anyone could find. A game warden had found Jane's grandmother, Ellen B. Woods of Golgotha, Virginia, wandering through a row of pines on a mountain road. Everyone in Marshall County knew it as the Government Road. Shortly after midnight on Thursday, when he found her, the game warden said that her arms were completely petrified. When she arrived at Johnston Memorial Hospital, 75% of her body had turned to stone. The outbreak of stone began in the palm of the victim's hand, radiating out to the fingers and up the arm. Skin tissue adjacent to the stone would become red and inflamed before blistering, then becoming rigid, and finally turning to stone, oddly veined limestone in Mamaw Ellen's case. During the blister stage, deep tissue beneath the affected area, including fat cells, muscle, blood, lymph, etc., would begin to petrify, followed by bone and cartilage. Ellen B. Woods of Golgotha, Virginia, placed a phone call to her granddaughter, Jane, from the hospital. 3/4 of an hour later, her body, except for the soft tissue of her eyes, had turned to stone.
I didn't get to tell my mama that I loved her before she died, but I guess that's what everybody says when they lose someone unexpectedly. It happened so fast that I didn't have time to really grieve.
The news reports all failed to mention that the phone call placed by Ellen B. Woods of Golgotha, Virginia, didn't actually reach her granddaughter. Instead, she said goodbye to Jane's answering machine. Jane has never listened to the message.
I want to hear her voice again, but I'm too chicken shit.
And so Mamaw Ellen became the 3rd officially documented victim of a real-life Gorgon hidden in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains. Of course, it isn't really a Gorgon, even as its supplicants ache in despair before their unblinking and madly indifferent god. It once fancied itself to be the pieces of some living thing. But that was very long ago. In 1942, a milkman named Frank Polanski was found by a coon hunter only a dozen or so yards from where Ellen was found. According to local legend, the hunting dog that had sniffed out the petrified remains never hunted again and could never again bear to be outdoors after dark. The Marshall County coroner, with the help of a geology expert from Emory and Henry College, conducted an autopsy to verify that the cadaver was a petrified human being, possessing a skeleton, internal organs, and tissue structures of stone, rather than simply a hyper-realistic anatomical sculpture. Another strange layer to the case was that Polanski had lived his entire life in and around Baltimore, with no known professional or personal ties to southwestern Virginia or northeast Tennessee. No one, not even Polanski's widow, has ever been able to explain why he was found in an obscure corner of rural Virginia, dressed in his white uniform. On December 5th, 1845, a preacher named James Archer Lewis was awakened in the middle of the night by a loud rapping beneath the bedroom window of Golgotha's Methodist parsonage. The building still stands at the end of Beulah Avenue, but has since been converted to an antiques shop. Lewis investigated the noise and found a woman in her 40s writhing like a string puppet manipulated by some madly twitching invisible hand. She spoke to the evangelist long enough to tell a disjointed tale of a hag in the woods, of glowing eyes the color and hue of sadness, and of the sensation of spiders possessed of many tentacles and probing feelers, spinning webs of limestone in her gut, before she fell to the ground in a state of utter petrifaction. Lewis read a service for the unidentified woman and buried her in a cemetery plot behind his church. In the late 1960s, a team of paranormal investigators were granted permission to dig up the grave in an attempt to ascertain the victim's identity. They found petrified remains in the exact state described by Lewis and a number of his parishioners. When attempts at identification failed, the remains were buried once more, this time in a newer cemetery a few miles outside town. 3 days before Halloween in 1978, this second grave was dug up and the remains were stolen. They will never be found.
The universe exists only in the present. Thus, the fabric of reality has already evaporated before the human mind can process it.
Jackson Trent
Everybody called him Jiffy Jack, but no one really knew why.
ran Mountain Empire Video and Knife on Main Street. Half the store was devoted to video rentals, while the other half was well stocked with outdoor sporting goods and knives. The old men whispered rumors that Jackson conducted a number of questionable activities in his store. Jane dismisses these claims.
You know how rumors are in a small town.
Jackson Trent was arrested on 2 counts of distributing pornographic material to a minor, and 5 counts of selling a firearm with an expired permit. A separate investigation found that a majority of his rental videos had been pirated.
I've been living with Jackson for several months. He had an apartment on the second floor of his store. It was always easier just to go through the store than to use the back entrance. I remember a skiff of snow had fallen the night before the funeral, and the wooden Indian outside the storefront was covered with slush. It's funny what you remember.
Her lower lip blossoms pink for 9 seconds and then goes pale once more.
I didn't like living there much. You remember that farmhouse in Night of the Living Dead? Or the cabin in the Evil Dead movies? That store was kind of like that. All the shadows and taxidermies. Everything dusty.
Daylight would filter through the store's filmy windows and fall onto knife display cases and shelves of new release videos. As one ventured deeper inside, the movies became older and more obscure. The stuffed game more fearsome with faces frozen in exaggerated rage. The horror and exploitation tapes lined the walls in the darkest corner of the building. They stood on narrow, unfinished wooden shelves, guarded by a stuffed brown bear clutching a rainbow trout.
The apartment above the store wasn't much homier. I guess Jackson was another one of my bad decisions in life.
At this point, Jane discusses the tape she found in the shoebox up on a beam in Jackson's apartment. She becomes increasingly agitated as she describes its contents and how viewing it has changed her life. Her sentences are little more than fragments, sometimes contradictory to previous statements. Those watching her interview will invariably become unsettled. Some experience nausea. Portrait of an unhinged woman. Among her more coherent and consistent statements, one can glean a few pieces of information. Apart from barely glimpsed abstract forms and unintelligible speech, probably attributable to old content that had been recorded over, The beginning of the tape is blank. Nearly 23 minutes elapse before any noteworthy content appears. Moments from Jane's life, past and future, real and imagined, play out in brief flashes, only seconds in duration. Awful moments. Moments captured by unseen cameras with impossible placement. Moments that have never been and should never be. Jane lists the scenes she remembers. She only viewed the tape once, but her recollections are crisp and urgent, ticking each one off with a trembling finger. Her speech slurs and increases in volume, as though she's delirious from fever or excessive drug use. Among the awful moments are these. A lonely Christmas morning with a 5-year-old Jane, sitting quietly while her mother leads a strange man to bed. His fingernails are long and dirty, his flannel work shirt stained with sweat and kerosene. Cut to her mother on her deathbed. A brief fight against HIV and a long acquaintance with crystal meth have rendered her a living corpse. Jane lowers her face to her mother's blistered lips.
Jane, please don't go.
She mumbles.
I need help shitting in the bedpan.
These were her dying words. Fade to prom night and Jane's date, Russell Boggess, actually a third cousin, drunk on blackberry shine and sawing open her panties with a buck knife. He jams his fat, calloused fingers inside of her and she sobs, looking up to the ceiling as if searching for assistance from some indifferent savior. Her desperate sobs continue, like a demented musical score, as the tape cuts to a cartoon sock monkey with hyper-realistic eyes. They looked wet and veiny, as though they'd been magnified by some eye doctor's tool. Recited the exact date of Mamaw Ellen's death, and another date, February 25th, 2006.
You've come to a horrible end,
the sock monkey says. Its voice is like a frightened child whispering in the dark. There are other scenes, but Jane either cannot remember them or cannot describe them. She mentions something about a claymation version of herself, vomiting and committing acts of self-mutilation. The final scene is the longest on the tape. A woman in her mid-30s fills the screen. She's pretty but distraught. She looks into the camera and makes a long, tearful confession. She's telling some unseen interviewer about all of the heartache she's endured and of some nameless dread that's invaded her life. However, the audio of her confession grows increasingly distorted and muffled, only to be replaced by the same low sobbing as before. Sobs turn to screams. Screams lengthen and become frenzied. Finally, the noise is more like the terrified and desperate barks of a small mammal as it is being flayed. Cut to static and blank tape.
Death is the only valid reality. All living things are fundamentally unreal.
Right now, I work on the overnight stocking crew at the Piggly Wiggly in Mountain City. I have a hard time sleeping nights, and I figured I'd not take advantage of all the time I'd be home by myself, in the dark. Since that day, since the video, I've had a hard time holding down jobs. This is the first one I've been at for more than 8 months or so.
She lists the dozen or more jobs she's lost since viewing the videotape and complains of health issues that she believes the tape caused. These include back problems, hypertension, type 2 diabetes, and an anxiety disorder resulting in vivid nightmares.
Sometimes when I wake up, the fear and the terror are all I can remember of the dream. Sometimes the dreams are as real as anything I've ever touched. They're as real as you. They're as real as the blinking light on that camera.
Her most frequent recurring nightmare is set in Jackson's video store. Sometimes snow is falling, sometimes heavy sheets of rain, but it is always dark, and Jane's dream self must always seek refuge in the store. The only light in the store is from the flicker of a television behind the counter. Sometimes the TV is the actual set in the store. Other times it's the ancient, large as a dresser, walnut console TV from Mamaw Ellen's living room. Standing opposite the television is Maman Ellen, in her limestone form. Her eyes are unusually wide and moist. Her cheeks glisten with teardrops. Her pose reminds Jane of a wooden Indian or a stuffed bear. In fact, some versions of the dream depict the petrified grandmother clutching an inanimate catfish or a bundle of wooden cigars. The video playing on the dream world's TV is similar, but not identical to the one found in a shoebox up on a beam, though it is always a pageant of atrocity, pain, and humiliation. Grotesque sock monkeys often make an appearance. Sometimes the video is not at all visible to the dreamer, but its effects are always felt. On a few occasions, Jane has attempted to fight the dream, to stop the video, to end her grandmother's captive torment. She always fails in these attempts.
That's what I dream at least once a week, usually more. Take it for what it is.
The nothingness is hungry.
It is now Christmas Eve, or rather, Christmas morning.
Jane is reading from a battered composition notebook. No one would consider Jane to be a talented woman, but she has a knack for doodling. Pages from the notebook are littered with pencil sketches of the same figure, a frail woman in white. Instead of a head, a late 1970s model Zenith television is perched atop her spindly neck. Her skeletal arms are a ruin of infected track marks.
My mama, the only one who's ever really loved me, is a slab of rock buried in a cheap cemetery plot. I believe that the hag in the woods killed her and then somehow authored a weird videotape to mock and torment me. That's what I believe. That is my only belief. Wet eyes stare back at me through every shadow, and on the backs of my own eyelids. There's nothing left for me here except this awful thing that's invaded my life. The 11 o'clock news is over, and static from the TV is stuck in my throat. I'm writing down what's happened in the notebook so that, if anybody cares, they might be able to answer the questions that I can't. As I write this, I'm parked somewhere along the government road. I'm looking for the hag that killed my mama. I hope to find out who she is and who I am. It's so dark, but I think we'll meet before dawn. I'm fighting my sleep now, but she's awful close. Whenever I close my eyes, I hear the same awful sounds from the videotape just outside my car.
The tape stops automatically, rewinds a trifle faster than it would in most players. Then small internal rotors whine almost imperceptibly just before the tape begins playing again. It advances 22 minutes and 56 seconds of mostly blank tape. A woman fills the frame, mid-30s, unkempt hair but still pretty. She's been crying. When she speaks, she sounds as though she's struggling with a lump in her throat.
My name is Jane Woods, and I'm a very ordinary person.
You have been listening to 2256, an original story written by John Iger. This story was first adapted for The Break Room Stories. Narrated by Jen, co-host of Our True Crime Podcast, with additional narration by Brett Norwood and Edward October. Octoberpod was co-produced by MJ McAddams, produced, edited, and directed by Edward October. Find all of our true, true-ish, and classic tales of horror and the paranormal on our YouTube channel, Octoberpod Home Video. Follow us on Instagram and Twitter at OctoberpodVHS or on TikTok at Octoberpod. Find us on the World Wide Web at OctoberpodVHS.com. Octoberpod, retro horror for bold individualists.
Thanks again for listening to Scary Time by Indie Drop-In Network. If you would like to nominate a scary or paranormal podcast to be featured, just send me a tweet at Indie Drop-In. I'd also love to hear if one of our featured podcasts is now your favorite show. Indie Drop-In survives off ad revenue and listener donations. If you would like to contribute, please consider buying me a coffee. You can go to buymeacoffee.com/Indie Drop-In. If you look at the very bottom of the episode description, you will see a link to make it easy. Indie Drop-In also has many other shows you might like. Just go to indiedropin.com. See you next week.